Well, good evening, everyone. Many thanks for joining us on this third Boris broadcast. And we're here this evening. This is the Boris Book Club on the Boris Broadcast YouTube channel. And we're joined this evening by the great John Ronson, who's going to talk to us about his book, The Psychopath Test. John's was at the festival last year.
No, 2 years ago.
2 years ago. God, yeah, we missed last year. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we can announce tonight is coming back in June this year, which is fantastic.
Yes.
Psychopath Test was, but before we get on actually to the book, you haven't been well, John.
No, I just got out of hospital with COVID. I managed to avoid it for 4 years. I got it about a month ago, and then I got a blood clot in my lungs, a pulmonary embolism, and then I had to go to hospital. And yeah, it was bad. The acute phase, I can tell you, was very fucking acute.
Wow.
But then, since then, I've been making a good recovery.
Good.
So it's all good.
Great.
The nurse turned out to be a fan of my books, which afforded me special favors. I got a bed that I could control the buttons myself.
Fantastic.
And when I was discharged, I got to go out through the staff exit. What I should have done, foolishly didn't even cross my mind, was I should have asked her to get all the doctors and the nurses to line up and applaud me as I was discharged.
That's the least you could have done. I'm amazed you would. I'm amazed you would even have to ask.
Well,
them.
I'd seen it on YouTube, but I thought, well, I fancy that.
I'm sure it happens on Scrubs or Grey's Anatomy on a regular basis.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm okay. I'm recovering well, but if I'm slightly breathless during this conversation,
don't
that's
worry.
the reason why.
Don't worry. Well, just by way of introduction, John's book, The Psychopath Test, was published in 2012 and was a tremendously successful book. And it was the kind of premise behind the book was what if society wasn't fundamentally rational, but was motivated by insanity? And this thought sent John on an utterly compelling adventure into the world of madness. So along the way, John met psychopaths, those lives who were touched by madness and those whose job it was to diagnose it, including the influential psychologist who developed the Psychopath Test, from whom John learnt the art of psychopath spotting, a skill which seemingly reveals that madness could indeed be at the heart of everything. So John, can you tell us about this man you met? Can we kick off with the great Bob Hare?
Sure. I should say two things. First, the reason why I wanted to talk about the Psychopath Test now was because it's 15 years since I set out on that adventure. And later on this year, I'm going to be doing a whole psychopath speaking tour, Psychopath Night, including, like 27 places, including places I've never spoken at before, like Ipswich. And so it was on my mind for those reasons.
Had you been waiting to go to Ipswich for a while?
Well, I don't know how the people of Ipswich will. I was worried about Harrogate too, because years ago I did a talk when my book Frank came out about Frank Sidebottom and the movie Frank. I gave this one talk in Harrogate where it was like a massive concert hall and about 10 people came, and it was one of those times. It happened once with the Men Hysteric Goats as well, that I gave a talk and 4 people turned up, and during that one, I remember during the Q&A, someone said to me, "I don't know why you seem so annoyed with us. We're the ones who came." And I felt that way about Harrogate. Anyway, I'm doing Harrogate again on this tour, and I was said to the promoters, like, Harrogate has no interest in me. But it turns out the Harrogate's almost sold out already, and it's not until October.
Fantastic. Well, they have a great crime festival there now, so that
maybe it's psychopaths crime, absolutely. And the other thing I wanted to mention was I've also just brought out the second season of my BBC show Things Fell Apart, so if at any point you want to talk a little bit about that too.
Fantastic. I listened to a couple of there's a great, actually, we might tie in and have a listen. We might talk about the Mickey, that character,
Mickey Willis.
Mickey Willis.
And I should say too, for people watching, that me and Cormac go back like 25 years, right?
About that.
When my first book, Them, was published. And when I went to Ireland for my very first speaking tour for Them, it was Cormac who looked after me. And every time I've come to Ireland, ever since, which has been many, many times. It's always Cormac who looks after me. So we go back a long way.
Yeah.
Including when the Psychopath Test came out.
Exactly. Yeah. That was a great
And
trip.
Bob Hare, you want to say no?
Yes, well, we start with Bob Hare. I mean, I did. I mean, a few weeks ago, I was looking at the book again, and I actually went through the list of the Psychopath Test itself. You know, the 20 items, and thankfully, it's only scored about 5 or 6, which is great. So I was very relieved.
That's good.
It's something I'd always avoided doing, but then I thought I'd better actually, as just to put myself on the mat, so to speak, or put myself on the table in the chair and do it. So that was good.
Yes.
But tell us about Bob Hare, and tell us about I mean, it's quite extraordinary, the research you did originally, isn't it?
Yeah, so Bob Hare's like the father of modern psychopathy studies. Pretty much when you think about psychopaths, what you're thinking about is Robert Hare's definition of psychopaths. It started for him in the 70s. He's a Canadian psychologist, and at first he was a fan of the previous psychopath guru, who's a man called Cleckley. And Hare was really building on Cleckley's work. Cleckley wrote this book called The Mask of Sanity. The idea, and The Mask of Sanity is an interesting title, because what it means is that psychopathy is this sort of weird mental disorder, because on the surface everything seems absolutely fine. Psychopaths are charming and can seem very empathetic and so on, but the madness is buried deep down. And so one of the great challenges for psychologists over the decades is how do we get the madness to the surface so we can treat it? And how do we even identify psychopaths? Unlike, say, if you've got OCD or whatever, if you've got OCD, you're invited to take part in your own diagnosis. But that isn't the case with psychopaths, because psychologists essentially don't trust psychopaths. And so they try and diagnose them from afar. I mean, I think I may be being a little overly broad here, but that's basically the case. So the first thing that Hare did in the 70s, when this was still allowed, was he would hook psychopaths up to like electricity generators, and he'd say, I'm going to count backwards from 10 to 1. And when I get to 1, I'm going to give you a really bad electric shock. So the non-psychopaths, in the placebo study or whatever, when he was going 3, 2, 1, they'd be sweating, because he had them hooked up to like EKGs or whatever. They'd be sweating and panicky and so on. But the psychopaths didn't sweat. Their heart rate didn't increase. And then at 1, he'd give him a painful electric shock. And then he'd repeat it. He'd do it again. And this time, the non-psychopaths in the study, they'd sweat even more and the heart would race even more. But the psychopaths still, nothing. And what Hare concluded was that they had no memory for punishment, which might be part of the reason why they reoffend. If you send a psychopath to prison and they have a terrible time in prison, they'll still very often go on to reoffend. So that was one of the theories he came up with then. But then they changed the law, and he could no longer electrocute psychopaths. So instead, he came up with a checklist, and the checklist is called the PCLR, and it remains to this day.
Did you notice that psychopaths had a very particular reaction to electric shocks as well?
Oh, you have to remind me.
Yeah, he just said that they'd shriek, and sometimes they'd shriek, and sometimes they wouldn't. Or the people.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I think at the moment of the pain, there was like shrieking occurred.
Yeah.
But then when he repeated the test,
yeah,
again, it was like they went down to nothing. Total, their amygdala. I think a lot of it's with the amygdala, right? Mm. I mean, those of us with anxiety, our amygdala.
And the amygdala controls your flight or fight, doesn't it?
Yeah, fight and flight.
Fight and flight,
and other things too, as far as I understand. I'm no neurologist, but as far as I understand, the amygdala controls your guilt, your remorse, your anxiety, shooting signals of fear and distress up and down to your central nervous system. Those of us with anxiety, we have overperforming amygdalae. though psychopaths have underperforming amygdalae, so they don't have fear, distress, remorse, which has always made me think that psychopathy must be pretty much the most pleasant feeling of all the mental disorders. So Hare then came up with the checklist, and the checklist that he came up with was is really the basis of my book, The Psychopath Test, because I decided to get taught the checklist so I could become a psychopath spotter, and then I would test the theory that's promoted in a lot of important places like Harvard, that you're much more likely to spot a psychopath at the top of the tree than at the bottom. You're much more likely to have a psychopath in your life as your boss than as your subordinate, if you're somebody who has subordinates. So I decided to learn the psychopath checklist and then journey into the corridors of power to try and spot psychopaths.
Great. That's fantastic. And what's interesting about the list is that the 20 items on it, I mean, you flick through it and you go, oh, you do, because you look at it, there's much more than actually when you go through it carefully. You don't say things like poor behavioral controls, shallow affect, impulsivity, we're all those things some of the time, and lack of remorse or guilt. Yeah, there's sometimes you are, but not in general. But that's
no. One thing that's made me laugh over the years is that the number of people who've told me that when they read my book, when they read the Psychopath Test, they started diagnosing themselves as psychopath and started really worrying about it. Like, oh my God, might I be a psychopath? But then there's a line in the book where I quote somebody saying that if you're worried, if you're reading this and you're worried that you might be a psychopath, that means you aren't one, because psychopaths never worry about being psychopaths. Like, what's there to worry about? No guilt, no remorse. I mean, Jesus.
And you went on a weekend with Bob Hare to Wales.
Yeah, West Wales. That's where I learned. That's where I did the course.
Yeah.
There was quite a lot of people on the course, maybe 30, 40 people. Most of them were like prison officers and care workers and people like that. I was really the only civilian that I could.
And it was a course designed for people to spot psychopaths. That's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they would say that's not the words that they would use.
Yeah.
I'm using civilian words here. But yes, it's about learning how to use the checklist. Because there's the checklist with the 20 items: glib, superficial charm, impulsivity, irresponsibility, promiscuous sexual behavior, and so on. But underneath, there's like other stuff. Like shallow affect is an interesting one. What that means is, and shallow affect, I think, links in with glib, superficial charm. And it's this idea that psychopaths are very charming on the surface, but then when you spend a little bit of time with them, you start to get this kind of eerie sense that there's nothing going on underneath the surface.
Yeah.
This, I think, is the big difference between psychopaths and narcissists. With narcissists, I think there's a lot going on under the surface. There's wounds that won't heal, and so they lash out and lash out. But with psychopaths, the notion is that there's nothing going on under the surface.
And did you find yourself after that weekend running around the country, spotting people, talking to people for 5 minutes and going, I think this might be a psychopath?
Oh my God, yeah. The first thing I started doing was identifying pretty much everybody who'd ever crossed me as psychopaths. So people had given me bad reviews. I remember he's passed on now, but A.A. Gill used to like always give me bad reviews.
Really?
So after doing the course, I just thought, classic psychopath.
Yeah. I heard a gag recently is that an alcoholic is someone you don't like who drinks the same amount as you do.
Right.
So you were falling into that. So anyone?
I absolutely was. And the second half of the Psychopath Test very much becomes a kind of cautionary tale to not get too drunk with your own psychopath spotting skills, lest you turn into a little bit of a psychopath yourself. Because there is something slightly psychopathic about reducing people to a mental health checklist to the most extreme. It's kind of what we do on Twitter. It's kind of what I wrote about in Safe and Perfectly Shamed. You know, you take a tweet and you completely define the person by that tweet. And it's the same thing with the misuse, I think, of the psychopath checklist. You define people by their outermost edges. So the second half of the book becomes very much about that.
And it's quite interesting because there's a lot of issues behind the book, and I think labeling is one of them. I mean, I really feel strongly that in the last, say, 10 or 15 years, with the whole with the great work that's been done on neurodivergence, that I think now people are saying, if there's something wrong or if someone's just rude, they say, oh, they're on the spectrum. And they're not on the spectrum. They're just being rude, and they know they're being rude. It's not and they're,
yes.
But it's become a I think we found ways of explaining things that don't need explaining. There's a really simple explanation in front of you. Someone's just being horrible, or someone's just being
right.
That's the way they react to the world, which is different to the way you react. But I think we've got very quick at saying, oh, that's the explanation,
Right. Well, you've got to the heart of one of my favorite topics in the world with that. And I'd say, as with all complicated topics, it's complicated.
Yeah.
So in season 2 of Things Fell Apart, one of the episodes, which is just out and available on all the podcast feeds, we dumped the whole series all at once for binging purposes. And one of the episodes is called A Hierarchy of Trauma, which is about the concept creep of PTSD and how that is misused, and how trauma is kind of used in certain circumstances as a weapon in the culture wars. So in that particular episode, I'm very much looking at the negative concept creep of certain mental health labels. On the other hand, what you just said about neurodiversity, obviously every situation is unique, but I think that the increased diagnoses of autism and awareness of autism is actually diagnosing a whole load of people who are autistic.
I'm not saying for a second. I did preface my remarks by saying I think it's a great thing. Yeah. But I think it's being used badly by some people, so that's the
totally. As I looked at in the trauma episode of Things Fell Apart, but I think something's really interesting is happening in the autism world, in that I think there's probably vast numbers of people who are autistic walking around with no idea that they're autistic, but because of the increased awareness of the label and the widening of the terms, that's a really positive thing, because but please don't think I was in any way, pointing the finger at you in any negative way.
No,
it's just so those two stories, I think, show both the positives and the negatives of the broadening of diagnoses.
Yeah, completely. I was very interested in the preface, the new edition of the book. You're Mary Jordan.
Mary Turner Thompson.
Mary Turner Thompson. Sorry, yeah. Who was on a bus? Who was on a train? Sorry, and just could you talk us through that story? She was on the train that exploded, or the train that was a bomb.
Oh no, that's Rachel North. That's a different person. Yeah. But Mary.
Yeah, well, let's go back to the first one, the preface you wrote, which was amazing.
Rachel.
Yeah.
Rachel North was. She was on a train on July 7th, 2005, which was, as I'm sure people remember, it was the day that 4 bombs went off in London, 3 on a train and 1 on a bus. And she was on one of the trains in the carriage where the bomb exploded, and she survived. And she went online to discover that loads of people, she became a kind of spokesperson for the survivors. And she went online. This is 2005, so this is a long time before the massive proliferation of conspiracy theories that we're suffering through now. She went online and discovered all of these people postulating that she didn't exist, and she was a team of MI5 spooks designed to spread false information about the bomb. So she confronted them. She said, I do exist, and it's not very nice to be told that you don't exist when you've just been blown up on a train. And what was extraordinary is that the more she tried to convince them that she existed, the more convinced they were that she didn't exist, to the extent that in the end she went to one of their meetings and said, look at me, here I am, I exist. What a, that was 2005.
And the guy at that meeting was with David Shaler, wasn't he? The guy.
Yeah, the former spy.
Yeah.
He was utterly convinced that she didn't exist, even though he was looking right at her. It was a very early example of what we're all living through now, which is people doubling down and tripling down and refusing to believe rationality and logic and instead believing, ludicrous conspiracies. It was a very early example of the horror that the world has become.
And which is quite interesting. I mean, back to the start of our chat, you're just out of hospital with your COVID-related illness. And I mean, those years, really from 2020 to 22, I mean, it was just boom time for the conspiracy theorists. And even, I got so many texts from people who were completely, I got a text from a friend, and this is an anti-vaxxer, and I just did a really quick Google, and I realized what I was looking at. This guy started off, and it was like 2 minutes in, it was kind of fine, and I was like, then I said, I'll just check these guys out before I decide watch the next 40 minutes. And this is a friend of mine who had watched all 40 minutes of it, and both doctors had been discredited. One was Australian, one was English. And they were on a Zoom talking about the whole thing, and it was just amazing how quickly it took hold.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, this is what all of season 2 of Things Fell Apart is about. What I discovered. So Things Fell Apart is a show I make about the origin stories of the culture wars. So what I'm trying to do is, the culture wars is such a huge, vast cacophony of chaos. So what I'm trying to do in Things Fell Apart is just tell these tiny human stories, very often origin stories about, so, if you go to a party and everybody's screaming at each other, it's impossible to know how all of that started. So what I'm trying to do in Things Fell Apart is go back to the moment that the pebble was thrown in the pond, creating the ripples. And in fact, speaking about anti-vax stuff, I discovered the most extraordinary pebble being thrown in a pond moment, which is the topic of episode 2 of the new season of Things Fell Apart. Will I tell you the story?
Please do, yeah.
Okay. It's about a woman, named Judy Mikovits. Judy was a scientist at the National Cancer Institute for 20 years. But then she gave it all up, moved to California for love, married her husband, David, and started volunteering at a yacht club behind the bar. And to cut a long story short, she got chatting to some wealthy people who went to this yacht club, and some of them had a daughter, some of them had a daughter who was very sick with chronic fatigue syndrome. And Judy was such a kind of fan of talking about viruses and how to cure viruses. She and the wealthy parents of this daughter, sick with chronic fatigue syndrome, set up an institute called the Whittemore-Peterson Institute, hoping to find a cure for chronic fatigue syndrome. This was in the mid-2000s. After just a couple of years, they announced that they had found what they thought was the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, you can imagine there's so many people walking around with chronic fatigue syndrome, desperate to find out something about their condition. And what Judy announced was that it was the result of a little-known mouse virus called XMRV.
Yeah.
Right? So Science published her findings, which is like, hitting the jackpot if science will publish your findings. And then researchers all across, America and I think the world started desperately trying to back up these findings or replicate these findings. Because if millions of people were walking around with this little known mouse virus, infecting each other with chronic fatigue syndrome, this was a big deal. But nobody could back up Judy's findings. So her bosses at the Whittaker-Peterson Institute started panicking and wanted her to hand over her materials. And Judy doubled down. She was like, no, I'm not handing over the materials. I'm not giving you the cell line. I'm not giving you the notebooks. And science is on the phone saying, you've got to retract your findings. Nobody can back up your findings. Retract your findings. And Judy's like, no, I'm not retracting my findings. And Judy started to think maybe there was some kind of conspiracy going on to suppress her findings for some reason. So next thing you know, Judy gets fired from the Institute. A colleague of hers takes her notebooks out of the Institute. Now Judy is being charged with theft. Then she escapes. She hides out on a friend's boat. So now she's a fugitive from justice, being charged with theft of her lab's property. She ends up going to jail for 5 days. So this terrible employment conflict became this hugely wounding thing for Judy. And then I'm cutting a long story short, and the whole story is in Things Fell Apart. But the upshot is she vanished. She finally accepted that her findings were wrong. And then she vanished. And then she reappears 6 weeks into lockdown as the star of a documentary called Plandemic, in which she was effectively getting revenge on the medical establishment for everything that had happened to her, and starts talking about, Fauci, and it's all a conspiracy, and she was one of the most eminent scientists in America, and she was imprisoned for her beliefs and so on. And the host of the documentary, Mickey Willis, didn't challenge her on any of this. I live here in a little village in upstate New York. 6 weeks into COVID, a neighbor of mine said, have you seen this documentary called Plandemic? This was the first, thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the first one, and watched by tens of millions of people. And it was Judy having a wound that wouldn't heal, getting revenge on the medical community because of everything that had happened to her over XMRV, creates this unbelievable ripple effect of this documentary Plandemic, which was watched by tens of millions of people who were being told for the very first time, everything you're living through isn't what you think it is. So what a ripple effect,
That's extraordinary.
Woman in a yacht club, through to
and it's quite, because if you bring that back to the psychopath test, I mean, that failure, one of the item 16 is failure to accept responsibility for your own actions. And then I'm sure.
Well, I think, look, I'm not going to armchair diagnose Judy, and I actually don't think Judy Mikovits is a psychopath. Yeah. But one thing that's useful actually about the psychopath checklist, though, I've done it a few times on people in interviews. I asked Katie Hopkins when I was interviewing her one time if I could do the psychopath checklist on her. Because even if the person you're interviewing isn't a psychopath, it's a really interesting way, into somebody's inner life to do the psychopath checklist on them. I mean, I think, as I said earlier, I think the difference between psychopaths and narcissists is that narcissists have wounds that won't heal, and they lash out and lash out and lash out. I think a lot of culture war thought leaders, the kinds of people on social media who escalate and escalate and escalate and won't let it go, won't let any slight go, just want to ruin people because they feel slighted. I think, though, that's a facet of narcissism.
Yes, yeah. Well, can we go back to Broadmoor and where you met Tony? And Tony was this. I mean, it's really an amazing chapter. Tony was a man who was so good at convincing people he was mad. He thought it would go softer sentence, but he was sent to Broadmoor, which, I mean, and what I was fascinated by is that it does happen, and unfortunately, it never works out well, because if you're that good,
It happens a lot. It's
Yeah.
amazing. So yeah, it was the Scientologists who told me about
Mm.
Tony. They said there's this guy at Broadmoor. For anybody watching who doesn't know, Broadmoor is a secure mental hospital. It used to be called the Broadmoor Asylum for the Criminally Insane. It's got quite a mythological reputation in Britain. Um, they said there's this guy at Broadmoor called Tony who faked madness to escape a prison sentence, and now he's stuck in Broadmoor and nobody will believe he's sane. Do you want us to get you into Broadmoor to meet Tony? So I said, yes, please. So one of the early adventures in the Psychopath Test is me going to Broadmoor to meet Tony. And yeah, sure enough,
Could you
he'd
just give
beaten
us
somebody up.
I mean, you've written brilliantly in the book. Could you give us just a quick picture portrait or portrait of Broadmoor? Like, how dark is it? How big is it? I presume there are big
Sure.
gates, you know.
Big gates. Well, the outside perimeter is like a big modern wall.
Mm.
You go in like you have to put all your stuff in a locker. Um, then you're sitting in a sort of waiting room between security doors. I remember I went there a few times in the end, and one of the times was a Sunday, and there was a woman there, a mother, had two grown-up children,
Wow.
both of whom were at Broadmoor, and she was there like for Sunday lunch with them. So sad, my God. So then, yeah, you're
John,
taken
it
through this.
definitely feels like a prison rather than a hospital. Or
I mean, that part certainly did. Then I'm taken through. You're taken through that more modern area, and then you're walking. I mean, this is years ago, so I'm just trying to remember the geography of it. But you then walk through a sort of inner perimeter yard type thing. The old Victorian Broadmoor's there somewhere. I'm not sure how much of the big old building is still in use. Then you're taken through to a cafeteria. I was there with Brian, the Scientologist, so he was like shepherding me through. And then all the patients started drifting into this like modern cafeteria. There could easily have been, a high school cafeteria.
and remind us of Tony's relationship with Brian.
You know what? I can't quite remember how Tony and Brian first got together, but Brian had taken on Tony's case because the Scientologist's big thing is that psychiatrists are all evil, mental illness doesn't really exist. I hope I'm not getting this slightly wrong. So a little bit like some of the anti-psychiatrists like Thomas Stav and people like that. The Scientologists are trying to like destroy the industry of psychiatry and especially the pharmaceutical aspect of it. So their purpose in getting me into Broadmoor is to show like, look, here's a guy who faked madness to escape a prison sentence, and now he's stuck at Broadmoor. Nobody will believe he's sane. Doesn't this show you how ridiculously pseudoscientific the psychiatry industry is? So that was Brian's like reason for wanting me to be part of the story. So the patients started drifting in, all of them and like wearing sweatpants and really looked like they'd kind of given up. A lot of them were quite overweight. And then a few of them were dressed in, most of them were dressed in sweatpants. A few of them were dressed in these kind of ornate, like, do you remember, who was it? Like that lord who owned Longleat would always dress in these big flowing robes and stuff.
Yeah,
do you remember?
Yeah, remember him.
Yeah, I've forgotten it. Yeah, anyway, somebody was dressed like that. And then Tony came in wearing like a suit, like a pinstripe suit with his arm outstretched, like clearly the outfit of a man who wanted to convince me that he was sane.
Yeah.
But the problem, as he said to me, is that the more, once you're at Broadmoor, the more you try and convince people you're sane, the more everybody just thinks you're nuts. Like one example he gave me was that, God.
I'm just saying it's like the character in MASH, the guy.
Oh yeah, Klingon.
Klingon, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Klinger, yeah.
Klinger, that's right.
Yeah.
So
you sat down with Tony.
Gave me
I
sat down with Tony a few times, on a number of occasions, and he told me his story. And his story was that he'd beaten somebody up when he was like, I think 17, and he was looking at 5 to 7 years in prison. Like, this was a bad beating. It was a homeless guy who had said something to his girlfriend, to Tony's girlfriend, and he beat the guy almost to death. And while he was in prison or jail awaiting trial, his cellmate said to him, "Fake madness. Just, if you fake madness, you'll get sent to a cushy hospital. You have your own PlayStation. Nurses will bring you pizzas." So what he did was he asked to see the jail's psychologist, and he said he wanted to watch women as they died because it would make him feel more normal. So I said, "Where did you get that from?" And he said, "Oh, from a biography of Ted Bundy that they had in the prison library." Anyway, he faked madness too well, and they sent him to Broadmoor, not a cushy hospital. If he'd just done his time for the crime, he'd have got 5 to 7 years.
And
but
he ended up at 14 in Broadmoor, did he?
14 years. Yeah, 12 years by the time I first met him, but by the time he was eventually released, it was 14 years.
No, absolutely extraordinary. Yeah. The people that you met, John,
yeah, definitely. But if anybody, I'm just going to say, if anybody watching this is thinking about faking madness to escape a prison sentence, definitely don't. That story I just told you about Tony happens apparently like remarkably often, and it never ends well. Because, as Anthony Maiden, his clinician, later emailed me, said, yes, we accept that Tony faked madness to escape a prison sentence because his delusions had seemed pretty cliched and not very believable. However, we assessed him and we determined that what he is a psychopath. And in fact, faking madness to escape a prison sentence is exactly the kind of cunning and manipulative act of a psychopath. He said it's on the checklist, cunning, manipulative.
But if you think of acting a role and you convince yourself that acting this role really well will save you, I mean, you're going to do it as well as you can. I mean, you'll be a long way down the road before you realize, oh, I'm doing this a bit too well.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And it's not nice. I remember I did see another part of Broadmoor because I went to Tony's tribunal, and that was in a different part of Broadmoor. And I remember looking in, and it was, just one of those depressing. It's a little bit like, I don't know if you've seen Louis Theroux's A Place for Paedophiles documentary.
No,
these huge, it's very good. It's one of my favorite of his shows. Just these,
It's very good to be watching Louis Theroux shows.
Oh yeah, for a while I couldn't because we were so competitive with each other, but I'm so glad that I've matured my way out of that, and now I can just enjoy his shows. But yeah, those airless, all a little bit like the hospital I was at, no natural light, all fluorescent light, and you're just in there and you can't get out.
Yeah. The people that you met, I mean, there's one fascinating character, the Toto Constant. He was a Haitian criminal, Haitian
death squad leader.
Yeah. And
a very.
And I mean, I think your interest there was really because his sentencing was that he was to go to America, live with his mother, not access the internet, and was your interest was really how he was going to adapt to that, or how he was going to.
Well, this was years earlier. So basically, after I decided to learn how to spot psychopaths, and after I diagnosed all the television critics who had ever given me bad reviews as psychopaths, I thought, well, I'd better, try a bit harder to, hone my psychopath spotting skills. And what I remembered was that years earlier, like 15, 20 years earlier, I met this Haitian death squad leader called Toto Constant, and I never did anything with the story. But the story was that, yes, he was a Haitian death squad leader, had committed terrible acts, like awful, I don't even want to say, they were so awful. But he got away with it because he was also working for the CIA at the time as an informant. And so he moved in with his mother in Queens, and he told the American government that if they arrested him, he would spill the beans about his time working for the CIA. So he did a deal with the government that he could live with his mother in Queens, but he was never allowed into Manhattan
Right.
So I can't remember how I first heard about this story, but I was very young. I was just starting my career. And I remember thinking, oh, that's funny. A death squad leader who has to live with his mum. Like, that's almost like a sitcom.
Yeah.
I'll go and see him and I'll do a funny story.
Yeah.
So I went to see him and it wasn't funny.
Yeah.
He all he wanted to do was like protest his innocence. And at one point he started crying. And I looked at him and I realized he was only pretending to cry.
Right.
This was a grown man in a suit pretending to cry. And at the time, I just thought it was kind
he
of
thought you might
creepy.
adopt him as a, great injustice story or something. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I presume anyway.
Mm.
My last memory of him was we went into Manhattan because, of course, he was flouting that particular law.
Mm.
And my last memory of him was in Soho, and he like waved goodbye. I waved goodbye. I went back to the car or the taxi, and I turned around to look at him one more time, and his facial expression had completely changed. And instead of like that, he was just staring at me, like,
Wow.
piercing stare. And that really creeped me out. And that was it. I spent a day with him, and that was it. And I never really did anything. I never did anything with the interview. But after I'd learned how to spot psychopaths, I thought, okay, I'll go back to him and do it on him. And it turned out that he was no longer living with his mother. He was now in prison in upstate New York, serving 12 to 37 years for mortgage fraud.
Wow.
And another item on the psychopath checklist is criminal versatility. So I went to see him in prison to test out my psychopath spotting skills on him.
Fantastic. Yeah. I mean, the other great story, it's the bigamy story, I mean, which has happened quite a lot. Is that did I get her name wrong? Is that Mary? Somebody Mary?
That's Mary. I don't want to tell Mary's story too much here, and the reason why is because she's going to be one of the mystery guests in my psychopath night that's coming up in October, November. And I think the fewer people know her story, the more amazing. Extraordinary it is when she's there telling it to the audience.
Looking back in the book now, after it's 12 years now.
I started writing it 15 years ago. And
I mean, how different? I mean, I know this is an impossible question now, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And then the rise of Twitter and social media over the last 12 years, how do you think that would have affected the story? I mean, especially I'm thinking of you've been publicly shamed. How different,
right?
If you were looking at a book studying psychopaths now, putting if you like, the layer of the kind of the layer of social media on top of it, how different do you think it would be now to sit down and write?
It's an interesting question. So at one point, I think actually while I was writing So You've Been Publicly Shamed, I thought exactly what you're sort of alluding to here, which is social media making us more psychopathic?
Yeah.
And I decided not to go like too far down that road, in part because I feel it's the kind of thing that somebody should study for years. And there are people out there who are studying. Kevin Dutton studies the sort of nature-nurture aspect of psychopathy and so on. But one thing that's really, so I didn't really go down a big road about it at the time, but one thing that's definitely true is that there's certain items on the psychopath checklist that are absolutely prodded at on social media. Right. One being impulsivity, how we impulsively leap on people and tear them apart for nothing. Another is failure to accept responsibility for our own actions, the way we tear somebody apart and then completely forget about it. There's a line in the psychopath, in Let's Say You've Been Publicly Shamed, where I say, the snowflake doesn't need to feel responsible for the avalanche. So undoubtedly, some of the items on the psychopath checklist are encouraged by Twitter.
Yeah, I think what the thing with Twitter is that people, and you do allude to it in the book, is that people forget, and more in the podcast, that people forget that these are real people who are tweeting as well. And
also, I did something. Can I say something? That annoyed me the other day?
Yeah.
It was actually probably about 2 years ago now, but I
Mm.
hold on to slights so close to my heart that
Yeah.
I think of it as just the other day. So I
Yeah.
made this documentary a few years ago called The Last Days of August, which is
Mm.
about a porn star called August Ames. It's not Audible, who took her life after being bullied on social media. And one of the conclusions that I came to was that there was a whole bunch of things happening in her life that led her to take her life, and not only what happened to her on social media that day. And The Last Days of August is really about a little bit like that J.B. Priestley play in Spectacles. It was about pinpointing all the little moments
Mm.
that
Mm.
led up to her suicide. Um, anyway, I won't say who it was, but I was interviewed by a kind of anti-cancel culture podcaster who, after The Last Days of August came out, and he said, "So have you changed your mind about seeing me publicly shamed now? Like you say that bullying wasn't the reason why she killed herself. So have you changed your mind now about seeing me publicly shamed?" And I got really annoyed. And then he went on to say, "I've been publicly shamed and I'm fine." And I wanted to say to him, I should have said to him, like, yeah, I was hit by a car once and I didn't die. So I'm not sure that I believe that people die when they're hit by cars. It
Yeah.
was so narcissistic, so self-involved of him. But the point is, one of the conclusions I come to in Say You've Been Publicly Shamed is exactly what you just said. When we tear somebody to shreds, or if somebody behaves not quite perfectly on social media, quite often there's other shit going on in their lives.
Mm.
And on social media, we don't want to think about that. So the fact is, August Ames was horribly bullied that day. She took her life. There was a whole lot of other stuff going on in her life. So that's not an anti-cancel culture argument.
No. Yeah.
It's a narcissistic argument about failure to respect responsibility for your own actions.
Yeah. But I also think a lot of the people who are so vocal about the cancel culture, and then they say they've been cancelled, and you think, you don't look cancelled to me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, well, funnily enough, that
yeah.
very same person who I'm not
Right.
naming, so I'm
Okay.
now just subtweeting him,
Right.
was recently cancelled.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
want to say to the guy, like, now do you get it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a great, I mean, in the book, I mean, one of the things I think not necessarily you're consciously trying to do, but there's seems to be there's differences between sanity, insanity, and eccentricity. And it's so
Yeah.
interesting how that these are they're very different things, but they're all kind of bound up together. It's like one curls into the other. And if someone just has, someone just has odd behavior, likes collecting
Mm.
weird stuff, that doesn't mean they're insane. But at the same time, if someone does something that really is completely off the charts, they're not just eccentric. And I think it's what you're in some of the book, you're really trying to tease out this difference and how important it is that this difference exists.
Right. Yeah, both the psychopath test and So You've Been Publicly
Mm.
Shamed kind of ends with the same conclusion,
Mm.
which is that, people are a mess. We're
Yeah,
complicated. On
yeah,
social media, we try and turn people into these, either magnificent heroes or sickening villains.
mm.
And in the psychopath test, I talk about, how we define people by their maddest edges. Um, but the fact is, most people are a mix of good and bad. And we are. We're strange. We're anxious. We're eccentric. We're odd. And quite often, our oddness is what leads us to do really interesting things. I'm fully convinced, just to bring it to myself for a moment, that if I wasn't odd, I wouldn't I wouldn't, work on my stories as unbelievably intensely as I do,
Mm. Mm.
polishing every microsecond or every syllable, depending on whether it's audio or print. And the stories wouldn't be anywhere near as good as a result. So yeah, I think my eccentricities, my strangenesses, my things that would be diagnosable as various different mental disorders are the things that have made me happy and successful in life.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking now immediately of your that great piece you wrote about the Kubrick archive.
And that's a great example.
Because I remember seeing the pictures of you and you describing going into the Kubrick archive, and I think that is just like is it the stables or that's rolling the rock up the hill that comes back? Is that Sisyphus? Whereas for you, it was Aladdin's cave. So,
it was a bit Sisyphus-y too, I think. So what happened was, God, back right at the beginning of my career in the mid-90s, I got this telephone call from a posh-sounding man called Tony. His name really was Tony. Broadmoor Tony. I gave him a fake name. His name isn't Tony.
Broadmoor Tony wanted to use his real name, didn't he, actually?
Yeah, he wanted to, but I just felt uncomfortable about it. And, and I checked with his clinician, and he felt the same way. And so I've actually never revealed Tony from Broadmoor's real name. But the other Tony really is called Tony. His name's Tony Fruin. And he phoned up and he said that his employer would like a copy of this documentary I'd made, which was the very first documentary I ever made. It was for Radio 4, and it was called Hotel Auschwitz. Okay. And it was about the marketing of Auschwitz. And I got to say, I sort of hit the ground running. It was a good documentary. And so I said, who's your employer? And Tony said, I'm not at liberty to tell you. And I said, oh, go on. And he said, oh, okay, it's Stanley Kubrick. So I sent off the tape, the cassette, and then I heard nothing. And then Kubrick died. And then after that, Tony phoned again and said, do you want to come up for lunch? So I went to Kubrick's house for lunch. And this isn't what it's like now. Now it looks like a beautiful mansion. But at the time, Kubrick wasn't interested in, interior design or, stuff like that. I remember thinking it looked like the Inland Revenue had taken it over, because everywhere you looked, there was boxes, filing cabinets, and more boxes, like 1,000 boxes. So I said to Tony Fruin, what's in the boxes? And he said, everything. Stanley never threw anything away. So I got home that night and I said to my wife, Elaine, what I just told you. And she said, well, you've got to ask them to look through the boxes. So I did. And then for years, first as a piece for The Guardian, and then as a documentary called Stanley Kubrick's Boxes, I went back there looking through the boxes. But yeah, it started off unbelievably exciting, as you can imagine, particularly at the time, because Kubrick was such a legendary mythological figure. Like, people didn't even know what he looks like, in the final years of his life. Never went out, and so on. So he was like a sort of Howard Hughes type, had that kind of mythology. So at first it was incredibly exciting, but then the reality set in that I had to look through 1,000 boxes, and certain members of the family were suspicious of me at the time. Not all of them. Christiane Kubrick was always utterly delightful, but certain family members, were worried, like, what was my intentions? So it was, there were times when it was a stressful situation too.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Like, what are you doing here? And then the same person would say the next time I visited, like, who are you? What are you doing here? Like, would forget who I was, and so on. In the end, it turned out fantastically, and the Kubrick family was incredibly supportive of the documentary. And I still think of Christiane Kubrick as one of the most extraordinary people I ever met. And we stayed in touch for a little while.
Great.
I went to a couple of parties up there. We had lunch. Yeah.
Oh, great. Fantastic. And I just finally just want to ask you, having written the book, and I mean, actually, I don't want to ask you anyone you've met since, but is there anyone in maybe 2012, 2013, 2014, was there anyone you met in the 90s or in the early 2000s that you thought, oh, well, he or she, definitely a psychopath?
Actually, yes. There was one person. I'm going to be they had to
you don't need to tell them, but just
immediately identifying.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Actually, there was one guy who I made a documentary about, who was just impossible. He withdrew access, and he would tell me that he would only let me have access again if I sat and thought about what I did. Really inside my head. Now I look back on him and I think he was there's a good chance that he was psychopathic. A good thing to do if you want to sort of flex your psychopath spotting muscles, is to try and get them onto the subject of empathy,
Yeah.
because psychopaths don't have empathy. So if you can like in a non-confrontational way, get them talking about their relationship with empathy, that's often a very good way of spotting whether they are a psychopath or not. If they say, yeah, a funny thing about me, I just don't really have much empathy. And that's happened a couple of times in my life. I've done that, and that's been
right. Well, we can go around the grounds of Boris' house in June, and we could we can do some psychopath spotting. So
yeah.
look forward to it.
I know, very excited. It's beautiful for people watching this. It's a lovely castle just outside of Dublin.
Yeah.
We all get to stay in the castle, all the speakers. It turns out that some of the speakers are secret traitors and somebody gets murdered every night. So that's part of the fun of it. Right. And the other two things I just want to quickly plug. So season 2 of Things Fell Apart is now up there for all to hear. And my Psychopath tour, which is a great big tour next October, November. Tickets are all on sale. Should be pretty easy to Google. It's Fane who are doing the shows.
Right.
So if you Fane, you'll find it pretty quickly. Right. Yeah,
and I just want
including in Dublin.
And I just want to plug everybody that John is definitely coming to Boris this year to the festival, and also that I'll be back here on the 22nd of February talking to Elizabeth Strout. In the meantime, I just want to say thanks a million, John. It's been great to see you, and we'll look forward to seeing you.
Cormac, it's always a great pleasure. You're a great constant in my life. So